power. You have a separation of powers. And that comes out of a Christian understanding. Or the whole reason that you and I can be independent journalists is because of Christianity. Until 1735 in this country, journalists had one job description: to make the king and his associates look good. If you wrote something negative about an important person, truth was no defense at all. In fact, truth made it worse. They had an expression: the greater the truth, the greater the libel. Because if you wrote something that was true, it was more likely that people would believe it. And if you were, in many ways, discouraging people to put all their faith in the king or royal governor, then you'd be thrown in jail. Truth was no defense at all. Seditious libel. In 1735 in New York, there was a Christian newspaper editor named John Peter Zenger who wrote that the governor was taking bribes and stealing land, which indeed he was. And so he ended up in jail. And then came the trial, and you can read the transcript of the trial. Zenger's lawyer appealed to the members of the jury by reminding them that biblical prophets had criticized the kings of their time. Zenger's defense essentially was, hey, if God's authors did this, so can Zenger. And the jury bought it. The jury declared Zenger not guilty. And that verdict reverberated through the colonies, and there wasn't a single prosecution for seditious libel after that. And, you know, Christopher, you note on page 271 that you don't have to put up with any fatwas here. I'll tell you, a lot of that's because of Christianity. Religion does not poison everything. And there are others who have concluded this as well. I mean, I don't want to just talk about my research. I met a couple of weeks ago Bob Woodbury, who's an assistant professor in sociology here, and he sent me his dissertation that he wrote recently at the University of North Carolina. I hope it's published. Because he describes how Protestant missionaries advanced education in British colonies because they wanted the people to read the Bible in their own language. And they created schools. They had mass literacy campaigns. And sure, I mean, you can look at missionaries who did harm, lots of it. But Woodbury shows, and he has lots of multiple regression analyses and all that good stuff, that evangelism, I'm quoting him here, evangelism by 1900 is by far the most constant predictor of modern elementary education all over the world with their British colonies. And that's part of an overall pattern. You can read historian Elizabeth Eisenstein. I mean, she's shown the Protestant Reformation led to a huge development of mass literacy in Europe. And Christians took the lead over the centuries in setting up hospitals. I mean, you can read the works of Jonathan Hill from your alma mater, Oxford, or Alvin Schmidt from Illinois, or Rodney Stark of Baylor. And they can show you the long-term effect of Jesus telling his followers to love their neighbors as themselves. And these writers, I mean, they're by no means propagandists. They're careful scholars. And, you know, your subtitle, How Religion Poisons Everything, compare that with the subtitle of one of Professor Stark's books. His subtitle is How Monotheism Led to Reformations, Science, Witch Hunts, and the End of Slavery. So the good and the bad. And that's a more balanced view, and that's what I hope you'll come to. I mean, this evangelical tendency, to help others, not poison them, continues today. Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times that America's evangelicals have become the newest internationalists, fighting sexual trafficking in Eastern Europe, slavery in Sudan. There's a Jewish leader, Michael Horowitz, who gave me a call this afternoon. We were just talking about stuff, and he reminded me of what he had written to evangelicals. Here's what he wrote. You have led the way in taking on the slavery issue of our time, the annual trafficking of millions of women and children into lives of sexual bondage. You have led the way in organizing a campaign to end a growing epidemic of prison rape. As you define your human rights successes as central to who you are and what you've done, it will no longer be possible for those who fear your faith to crudely caricature you or ignore the virtue that Christian activism brings to American life and the world at large. And Michael spoke too soon, because despite all the evidence, Christopher, you write that religion poisons everything. You really don't believe that, do you? Everything? Thanks.
All right, 10 minutes. Mr. Hitchens.
Yes, well, thank you.
Go get him.
Well, I would have thought it was too much to expect that my other speaker would have devoted all his remarks to me, too. I mean, they don't exaggerate when they say Texas hospitality. It's very kind of him to make me his special subject, but let me try and take some of his points in order. First, a very small one, the Diane Sawyer point. I think she did say that when she saw the second plane go in, but I've seen the film, the only film there is, of the first plane going in. It's rather harder to see, and so you get the first words that are said in the post-9/11 era, or the immediate post-atrocity moment. And those words are spoken by a man on a big fire truck in New York, where the camera is mounted. And he says, can you guess? Yes, you can. Holy shit. And that was exactly a correct description of what was going on. much more accurate than Diane Sawyer calling on God, which even I will do when I've run out of words or, above all, concepts. Yes, of course I'll say thank God. What else is there to say? I'll say it, if you like, as a courtesy, but don't over-attribute it. Now, had I said that philanthropy was poison, or charity was poison, I think you would have probably had me over a barrel. I say in my book, I give quite a lot of time to it, actually. I have a moment in Africa, in northern Uganda, where I was recently. I don't just sit in northwest Washington, as it happens, where I was doing the following thing. I was seeing the progress of probably the most cruel and horrible war, not just in Africa, but anywhere in the world, since, I should think, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I think it outpaces the Darfur War in its horror and cruelty, if not in its scale, for this reason. You've probably heard of the Lord's Resistance Army of northern Uganda and of its terrible leader, Mr. Joseph Kony, who wants to impose the rule of the Ten Commandments on Uganda. He's a former altar boy, and whose army is made up of kidnapped children who are turned into zombies and sadists at a very young age and sent out to kidnap other children to replenish the ranks. And there's a real evil to this because, of course, even the Acholi tribe, the people who suffer most from this ghastliness, don't want very rigorous measures taken against this terrifying little army of children for fear that their own kidnapped children will be killed. So it's a sort of double indemnity. And it's enormously retarded the recovery of Uganda in the name of God. And though it's a Christian force, very explicitly so, its paymasters are actually the Sudanese murderers who've commissioned the genocide in Darfur, because they want a revenge on Uganda for Uganda's help for the South Sudanese Liberation Army. So it's all a wonderful faith-based nightmare down there. And I was sitting in a camp where these children are gradually, some of them come in and give themselves up, some of them are captured, some of them get lost and are picked up. Terrifying children with guns and eyes of stone, who've learned so much about cruelty in such a short time that it shrivels your heart, being rehabilitated. And the people doing this were a rather fundamentalist, but very decent Christian group. Can't remember exactly which, the World Forum something. And I was sitting with the man who ran it and said, well, I'd like to ask you a question. I said, as an unbeliever, which of you do you think is the most sincere Christian? I mean, here's Mr. Kony, who really goes out and fights like an Old Testament man and says he's going to impose the law of his tribe and his people and his teachings on everyone. And he wants the Ten Commandments and nothing else. And there's you. And you're doing what any secular group could do. I mean, Amnesty International could be doing what he was doing. Not Amnesty International, in fact, but you know what I mean. Human Rights Watch, in fact, in Uganda is doing that and much more. And I know literally hundreds of secular missionaries and human rights workers who do what they do for its own sake, not to proselytize for a church or witness for a faith. Actually, to my surprise, the man took the question very seriously. He said, I often asked it myself. I don't know which of us is the real Christian. I have no means of knowing. Maybe it's Joseph Kony, maybe it's me. Well, you see, my case is the following. There really couldn't be another answer to that, because if you need a Christian or religious reason to do what you ought to be doing anyway for your fellow creatures, it seems to me at best superfluous, and at worst perhaps slightly, just very slightly, I don't mean to denigrate anybody's humane work, slightly suspect. Why would you need an extra reason? Hope I'm making myself plain here. Why, could it be proselytization? It very often is. Could it be the feeling that you yourself will get an eternal reward for it? Well, you're supposed to. Secularists who undertake this kind of work can't be suspected of this kind of thing, nor of trying to win converts. It seems to me it's an optional belief. By all means have it. What you've said is being done by any of the people you've mentioned is being done by religious Jews on the West Bank, though they want to bring on the Messiah and Armageddon and bring about the end of the world, and by Muslim groups everywhere. In fact, Hamas it justifies its whole rule in Gaza, a disgusting dictatorship that it is, by its provision of social services to the poor, the needy, or, as Mother Teresa would always put it, the poorest of the poor. That's exactly their justification. The same is true of Hezbollah in Lebanon. If you lie it once, you lie it for everybody. It isn't an argument. It's barely even an observation. And when I said about evangelicals, I meant to say, and I said about a very revealing film which you may have seen about Marjo Gortner, the little boy who was put onto the preaching circuit by his parents. His name is an anagram of Mary and Joseph, and became one of the biggest tent draws around the country, a national superstar, while his life was ruined and exploited by these gruesome parents. And I don't know how